The Gothic has had an established presence in all artistic mediums for well over 100 years, but its legacy and impact on film have, for me, been the most memorable. Gothic film started as an adaptation of Gothic literature and upheld the classic narrative conventions of the genre: large foreign castles, flawed and doomed protagonists, and most importantly, a deep fascination with mystery and the supernatural. Once films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu set a precedent for the characterization of the Gothic in cinema, other films could continue this ever-evolving subgenre with original stories. Because the Gothic has a much longer history in literature than in film, Gothic film is more closely tied to themes and narrative conventions than it is to any specific style of presentation. Because of this freedom of expression, as a genre, Gothic film can appear inconsistent with itself, but this is only a byproduct of the variety of different techniques directors have at their disposal for adapting Gothic stories. It is this apparent inconsistency that I think makes Gothic films interesting and worth discussing. Today we will look at two films and the different filmic techniques both use to communicate their Gothic themes. The two films I've decided to look at today are Suspiria 1977 and Hereditary 2018. Suspiria is an Italian horror film directed by Dario Argento, and it has been very impactful in developing Gothic film as well as horror more broadly. I chose it because it's a great example of how Gothic film got its starts and for its influence over the genre as it went on. Hereditary, on the other hand, is a psychological horror film directed by Ari Aster. I think it's relevant to our discussion because it's an example of how Gothic films continue to put forward new techniques and ideas even in the modern era. In this video, we will look at how these two films interact with three staples of Gothic text and what techniques they use to enhance those literary devices. First, we will discuss creating a Gothic space and what these films do to make their settings seem Gothic. Then we will look at the different ways the two films portray a doomed protagonist and how they communicate that visually. And then finally, we will touch on how the films choose to portray the supernatural. In my opinion, the most important thing a film can do to feel Gothic is creating a Gothic space. The legacy of Gothic filmmaking is, in part, the image of a castle on a hill. Sometimes, mirroring Gothic architecture is what connects a setting to the Gothic, but more often it's about emulating the feelings that those castles inspire. The setting of a Gothic film should be isolating and foreign to the audience. Suspiria and Hereditary achieve this goal in different ways, however. Suspiria is primarily set in a dance academy in Germany, which is actually a front for a witches' coven, and although this setting is literally foreign to the main character, that is less important than how the setting is actually portrayed. Suspiria has been compared to a dark fairy tale, and for good reason. Suspiria goes to great lengths to distance itself from literal reality, and therein lies the foreign atmosphere. Most notably is the lighting of the film. Neutrally lit shots are few and far between, and they are designated to locations outside the main dance academy. While inside the academy, most rooms are thrown in deep reds, blues, and greens. This lighting is never acknowledged by the characters, so we can assume that it is purely a cinematographic decision and not a diegetic difference between the two locations. By isolating this dreamlike environment to the scenes within the dance academy, the film impresses upon the viewer that the dance academy is home to the supernatural, and then our Gothic space is constructed. Hereditary, on the other hand, faced a much more difficult challenge when trying to turn its setting, an upper-middle-class American household, into an alien one. In this story, the depiction of the house is designed to mirror the characters' perception of themselves as a family unit. Early in the film, the house is well lit and shot from shoulder height. This is designed to reflect how the family sees themselves as a normal family unit. But in moments of peak familial anxiety, the house is thrown into a much more Gothic depiction. Metered usage of low Dutch angles and harsh shadows in the corners of rooms turn what was once a place of comfort into something every character would rather escape. Next, I'd like to talk about how the two films visually represent doomed protagonists. Having a main character with some sort of curse or fated downfall has been present in Gothic literature from its inception, but film is granted the extra fold of being a visual medium that can manipulate the audience's perspective directly. So it's interesting to look at what techniques the director uses to make these characters feel doomed. First, Suspiria. Although the main character, Susie Bannion, escapes the dance academy at the end of the film, there are multiple murder chase scenes that take place before the climax of the film, and work as miniature versions of the doomed protagonist, as we take the perspective of the characters being killed. In all of these scenes, the threat of death is clearly communicated through the soundtrack and through the characters' reactions, but what exactly is threatening the character is never shown. This instills in the audience a different sort of dread than a standard serial killer movie might. The Gothic setting of the film also contributes to this ambiguity. Since the Dance Academy is depicted so otherworldly, the audience can distance themselves from the lives of its characters. When Sarah is being chased through the attic, it feels as though she has no hope, because this is a fairy tale, we know how this story ends. And at the end of the scene, when she accidentally throws herself into a pit of barbed wire, this isn't read as an unrealistic mistake, but rather the next step in the story. It feels like this because of the specific way that these death scenes are constructed. In Hereditary, the Graham family is doomed from the outset. Following the death of their grandmother, the Graham family is manipulated and torn apart by a cult, of which the grandmother had been a leader. By the end of the film, it becomes clear that the cult had had full control of their lives ever since the grandmother's funeral. So what techniques are employed to reflect this manipulation? Before we can understand that, we need to understand one more framing device that the film uses. Annie Graham, the mother of the family, is a miniatures artist. Through the film, we see her constructing very precise models of various events in the lives of her family members, all for an exhibit that is ultimately canceled. In many ways, the Graham family themselves are like miniatures. Every detail of their lives is constructed by unseen outer forces. It makes sense then that their life should be filmed as though they were miniatures. Annie's miniatures are constructed with one wall of any given room missing so that outsiders can peer inside. And similarly, the set of the house was constructed with one wall missing, or it at least appears to be. There are several examples of shots in the main living room or the dining room where the camera is pulled far enough back that it would be inside the wall. This, combined with liberal use of deep focus and lateral tracking shots, makes the lives of the Gramleys seem very artificially constructed, as it is by the cult, especially on a second viewing where the audience understands the role that the cult plays in their lives. Finally, I'd like to talk about how these films choose to portray supernatural elements. Supernatural elements are at the very core of what makes a story Gothic. Unlike the other elements on this list, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Gothic story without any supernatural elements. These films we are talking about today are no different. What unique techniques do these films use to convey the supernatural? Suspiria's supernatural elements are very intentionally unknowable. We've already mentioned how in the murder scenes, the exact mechanisms the witches are using to kill people aren't known by the audience, but this ambiguity is supported by other sections of the film as well. For example, in the film's climax, Susie puts together the clues and finds the secret meeting place of the witches who run the school. She stumbles into a side room where the ancient decrepit leader of the witches, Mother Marcos, waits for her. In the final confrontation, Susie stabs Mother Marcos and the school is destroyed. But importantly, Mother Marcos is obscured in some way or another up until the final moments. First by a cloth surrounding her bed, then she appears invisible, and even after Susie stabs her, we are shown the body in pieces. Quick cuts between very zoomed-in shots of her body reiterate what the entire film has shown up to this point. When it comes to the supernatural, there is simply too much to see. Hereditary is very much on the other end of the spectrum. Where Suspiria was concerned with making a spectacle out of its supernatural events, Hereditary is much more interested in making the supernatural seem natural. Hereditary was released at a point in time when film series like Insidious and Paranormal Activity had saturated the market with a very standardized form of house possession movies. Astor was obviously interested in subverting this audience expectation for how possession should be depicted. The supernatural turning point in Hereditary comes when the Graham family is tricked into summoning the spirit of their dead daughter Charlie. Other films might take this opportunity to quicken the pace of the film for easy scares, but Astor slows things down. The seance scene is one of the longest continuous takes in the film. Combine that with slow camera movements and muted lighting for a surprisingly gentle portrayal of the supernatural. This decision to mellow out the supernatural elements allows for the reactions of the family, the main focus of the story, to take precedent. In conclusion, Suspiria and Hereditary are excellent examples of what makes Gothic filmmaking so interesting. Not only do they utilize conventions of Gothic literature in completely unique ways, but the specific filmic techniques they use to portray those conventions are very different from each other. Gothic art has existed for well over a century, and with that comes a wide array of media that can be technically called Gothic. It's important to understand that there could never be a complete checklist of everything a film required before it could be considered Gothic, as there are so many pieces of Gothic literature to draw from, and even more ways to portray them. That's no reason to be upset, though. I think the reason Gothic films continue to stay relevant today is their ability to change over time, and there are perhaps no better case studies for this adaptability than Suspiria and Hereditary.